Welcome to this new section of the Video Production Masterclass. This is Cameras 101, where you're going to learn the basics of how a camera works, learn some of our budget recommendations to get started. So in this lesson, I want to talk about how do cameras capture video. And to do so, we need a crash course on the history of film cameras. So developed throughout the late 1800s and early 1900s, film video cameras or film movie cameras capture images in rapid succession. And then when played back at that rapid succession, it makes those photos that are showing to you look like video or look like they're moving. Just like in photography, light travels through a camera's lens and it hits the film and exposes an image on that film. And with an old film movie camera, there's literally a strip of film that's going through, passing behind the lens, and there's a shutter that opens and closes, or actually it's a circular shutter that's rotating, and there's a little bit in there, there's an angle that's open, and light passes through as that's rotating and exposes the film. And that's where you get the term shutter angle, because there's literally an angle of that circle that actually represents what the shutter speed is. So we're going to go through a couple terms that you will want to know about, and I'm talking about them in terms of the old film cameras, but you'll see as you work through this course that they are representative in digital cameras today. So I just mentioned shutter angle or shutter speed. We're going to come back to that. But first, frames per second is how many frames are being exposed per second. So if you're filming for 1 second, how many individual photos are actually being taken is how you can think about it. So what they discovered is that 24 frames per second becomes the norm. It's the natural capturing and displaying of human motion. And so when they started, they had slower frame rates because the cameras just weren't fast enough. And you'll see those first films that were captured in 10 frames per second or 15 frames per second, the motion looks a little jittery, and that's because the frame rate was slower. A lot of people get this confused with shutter speed. Shutter speed is how long each of those frames is exposed to the light. So let's slow this down really slow. So a frame and we're talking about old film cameras. It doesn't technically work like this in digital cameras, but in the old film cameras, the film would go down behind the lens in the spot where it is exposed. The shutter would rotate and an opening would open up so light could pass through. And depending on how long that light is exposing that frame, that's the shutter speed. The next frame would go by, the circle shutter would rotate again, and then the opening would pass through, light would pass through, expose it, and that length is the shutter speed. The 180-degree rule states that the shutter should be double the frame rate to mimic the way the human sees motion in real life. So they found that for 24 frames per second, if you exposed each frame for 1/48th of a second, so 48 twice 24, that makes motion look natural. Now, if you're exposing for a longer time, motion is going to be a little bit more blurred. If you're exposing for a shorter time, motion is going to be more clear. And if you wave your hand in front of your face, you'll notice that your hand is naturally blurred. Your brain can't comprehend every single motion of your hand, and it actually ends up being blurry. And so there's this balance of having a little bit of motion blur, but not too much. And so that's what they found out with that rule of double your frame rate is what your shutter speed should be. And the same thing goes for digital video now. If you crank up your shutter speed, you make it 1/2000th of a second, the motion starts to look a little bit like weird. It's not natural because you're seeing everything so clearly. And if you slow down your shutter speed too much, you get too much motion blur, and that doesn't look natural, although you can use these for stylistic purposes as well. So frames rate is how many frames you are actually exposing per second. Shutter speed is how long each frame was being exposed to light for. And the last thing I want to talk about with old film cameras is the quality of the film. The quality of the film literally depended on the size of the film. So you had different sizes that were standards. 35 millimeter became sort of the standard for most motion pictures, although there are 70 millimeter films as well. And you'll hear that even nowadays when they're playing an old film that was shot in 70 millimeter because it was shot at such a higher quality. 16 millimeter was also very popular for films. It's obviously going to be cheaper when you're using smaller film. It's cheaper to produce, cheaper to develop, cheaper to make cameras that were smaller to film that way. And then there was even 8 millimeter film, which was something that a lot of people actually had their own film camera, 8 millimeter film camera. And that was like the original home video that our parents, grandparents might have shot with back in the 50s, 60s, 70s. And similar to today, where the size of your camera sensor will increase the quality of your video, it's just like that with film. But we're not using film cameras anymore, at least not most of us. There was a digital revolution that happened through the 90s, 2000s, and the recent 2010s. Digital video became the norm, not only for home video, but also for professional Hollywood video. If you're watching Netflix, most of what you see is probably shot digitally. The quality has gotten so good that for a while, there was this battle of, oh, I'm only going to shoot film because I want to be traditional and I want to shoot it the right way. I want it to have that look. But honestly, digital video has caught up to film in terms of quality. Of course, there's an aesthetic of old film that does look nice. It has that, as I say, aesthetic that is hard to capture with digital film or digital video, but it's getting close. The proliferation of DSLR photography cameras and now mirrorless cameras that include a video option has made it the norm for independent video creators. So you might be out there with a DSLR or a mirrorless camera, and that's what you're using. What you might have in your pocket, your smartphone shoots amazing HD or 4K quality video. And digital cinema cameras are higher end options for filmmakers that want more control and ease of use. Now, throughout this course, we're going to be using the term filmmaker. There is one camp that says you can only say filmmaker if you're technically using film. You can only make films if you're using film. To me, it doesn't matter. I went to film school, even though we learned film, most of us were shooting on video, but we still called it film school. So whatever side of the camp you're on, that's totally fine. But I just want to say that we will be using that term in this class. So there's lots of things about a digital camera capturing video that are similar to how film cameras did. Of course, you're not actually having a roll of film that's being exposed to light, but there is a digital sensor inside your camera that is being exposed to light and capturing that information digitally. It's capturing that image digitally. Your camera still has a lens that has an opening inside of it, an aperture that opens wider or smaller to let in light, something we'll be diving into deeper in this class. You can adjust the shutter speed. It's digital. It's not literally a circular disc that's letting in light, but you're still adjusting how long each frame is being exposed. So while the mechanics are different in digital cameras, how it works is actually very related to how the film cameras worked. So hopefully this background gives you a great place to jump right in to choosing the right camera for video for you, which I'll be talking about in the next lesson.